there's the remote.
Great. Thanks.
Welcome to Science-Based Choices for Climate Action. This is our second session of the day. I'm Neil Leary of Dickinson College. Thank you for joining us, whether you're here with us in person at Dickinson College or attending remotely via the live stream. During the session, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. If you're in the audience here, you'll raise your hand. If you're watching the live stream, you can type your questions into the chat, and we'll be watching for those and posing those to our panelists. State your questions concisely and respectfully when it's time for that. Also, to point out, because some of you are new here, so in case of an emergency, look for the exits. The main exit is off to my left here, your right. There's another exit up to the back there, and there's a handicapped accessible exit that's behind me through the curtains, the drapes, and we will help you with those drapes should the need arise. Now, for this session, what we're looking at is, the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's critically important work. They provide authoritative information about climate change, the science of the climate and Earth systems, risks that are posed to people and ecosystems, response options. But very few people, even if you read about the IPCC in the New York Times or other press, very few people really know, what is it? What do they do? How do they do their work? So in this session, we are going to try to demystify the IPCC for you a bit, get some understanding of what it is, what it's about. To help us with this, we have here two authors of the Sixth Assessment Report. Karen Seto of Yale University, the School of the Environment. She was a coordinating lead author of the IPCC's Working Group 3 chapter on urban mitigation of climate change. She did that both for the Fifth Assessment Report and the Sixth Assessment Report. Alex Ruane of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. He's a coordinating lead author for the IPCC Working Group 1 chapter on climate information for regional risk assessments. We were also going to be joined remotely by Saleemul at the Independent University of Bangladesh. He just notified us a short while ago he's not going to be able to join us. The reason for that is a tropical cyclone is bearing down on Bangladesh at this very moment. There's power outages, no internet connection. I'm not quite sure how Saleem managed to get an email to us to let us know what's going on. But this is an example of the ways in which we are always vulnerable to, at risk to climate hazards of various kinds. And so we should have that in mind as we have our conversation here. Yeah, please do come on in. Don't be shy about it. We're very informal here. All right, so let's start off with a very basic question of, what is the IPCC and what does it do? Who would like to get us started?
I'm happy to.
Go for it.
So the IPCC was established in 1988, and it was established by the World Meteorological Organization and the UN Environmental Program. And the original mandate actually still remains. And the mandate is tell the international policymaking community what is the state of the science on climate change. And so the work of the IPCC is broken into three big groups. There's one group that focuses on what is the state of the physical basis of climate change. What do we know about climate change in terms of literally climate change, the climate science, the physical basis of climate change? And then the second working group focuses on what are the impacts and vulnerabilities of climate change. In other words, how will climate change, that's being assessed by working group 1, how will it actually affect people and ecosystems? What are the impacts? And then the third working group focuses on mitigating climate change. How do we slow it down? How do we arrest it? How do we actually stop climate change? What are the strategies out there to stop climate change? So those are generally the three working groups, and essentially the IPCC generates the science that goes, hopefully, completely informs policymaking at the international level. It's intended to generate the science that informs the UNFCCC.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. The IPCC is also an organization. There's all kinds of people involved, and the organization is generally formed on these assessment report cycles. So we are just finishing up the 6th assessment report cycle now. The first one came back in 1990. And the idea of these assessments is to provide that information for the countries, for the governments, and the policymakers. The IPCC is very prominent in the scientific community, but it's really not made for the scientists. It is an opportunity for the scientific literature and basically the understanding of the scientific community to be conveyed to the policymakers so that they could inform the overall negotiations of the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that convention actually has made indications that they will listen to the IPCC through their process, so that the information that comes from the IPCC provides that scientific evidence for that policymaking.
All right, thank you, Alex. So part of the work of the IPCC, part of the focus of the work of the IPCC is doing scientific assessment. Tell us a little about what is a scientific assessment? How does it differ from a literature review? How does it differ from doing original research? Give us some sense of what this assessment activity is about.
Maybe I'll get started on that one. So this took me a long time to figure out because it's a little bit nuanced thing, but in doing the reporting and doing the assessment, it becomes much more clear. A scientific review might be one of those things where you go out and you find the most prominent papers and you write up what they said and say, you know, this is how you can catch up. And when I was a graduate student, these were invaluable, right? Because you're trying to find that cutting edge. You're trying to figure out what is the level of research that has been done and what might come next. The assessments that we do in the IPCC are designed to go a little bit further than that. It's to say, what is the state of understanding in the scientific literature, to draw out those key messages and to attach confidence and uncertainty language to those findings so that we understand, you know, is there substantial evidence? Is there high agreement? Are there enough multiple lines of evidence that we really believe something is happening? And even the word belief probably shouldn't be used here. It's what do we see in the scientific evidence that allows us to make those types of statements to support the policy.
Anything to add on that, Karen, or do you think that covers it? All right, okay. So another aspect of the work of the IPCC, and you've alluded to this, is there's this sort of, you know, I had been involved in the IPCC for the third assessment report, and there was a mantra that we had of that the reports of the IPCC were to be policy relevant. But not policy prescriptive. Can we chant that together? What does that mean? How does that interpret that directive? Please.
Yeah, well, that's still the mantra, so things have not changed that much. I mean, the idea is, Alex said, that we are assessing the scientific literature and developing a synthetic understanding of what the state of the science is. So we want to be policy relevant. We want to understand, like, what does the science say about X, Y, and Z? What is the confidence around this? What are the different solution spaces for different parts of the world, for different sectors? But we're not saying to policymakers, this is what you should do. And that's a really, really big difference. So when we say that we're not meant to be policy prescriptive, I mean, when you're being prescriptive, right, you're saying, you should do this. We don't say in the IPCC, anybody should do anything. We basically lay out these are all the different solution spaces. And every decision maker, every policy maker has different financial, governance, institutional, human constraints. And so the strategies that are actually undertaken by different policymakers will differ by region. But our job is to lay out the different solution spaces and to assess them, and not to say, you should be doing this, this, or this.
Maybe I'll just add one thing there, which is this is a constant editing task, right? We go through and say, government might think you're imposing your opinion on, a scientific matter. If you say need to or should or must or any of those words, we're always, double checking. But what we can talk about is if your goal is to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees, then this is the carbon budget that you have left. Those types of conditional, needs are something that we can talk about. And in that sense, we do a lot of work looking at scenarios. What is the outcome of the current trajectory or a proposed set of policies? And likewise, turn it around. If your goal is this, what would you have to do to reach that goal? That type of thing is not so much judging what your goals are or judging what the various policies are, as much as saying the science tells us these likely outcomes from the choices that you make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that editing and being very precise about the language is important. I think when we read in the media and the press the coverage of some of the IPCC reports, I've seen stories that have said that the IPCC in its latest report has said that we must cut emissions to net zero by such and such a year. Have you been seeing that in the press, and how? Does the IPCC need to respond to that, or what sort of challenges, issues are created in situations where you're seeing prominent media seemingly to put words into the mouths of the IPCC that maybe are not quite as nuanced as this policy relevant as opposed to policy prescriptive? Any thoughts on that?
I'll give a quick one, and maybe Karen can add. At some level, our job is to put the report out there with the scientific evidence. The media landscape is vast and comes from many different directions with many different opinions, and we really only have a certain amount of ability to engage or control anything related to that. There is extensive media engagement around the IPCC report. We put out really useful communications tools, fact sheets, just the overall level of graphics and communications expertise in the IPCC is like nothing I've seen elsewhere. So, one of the things we're constantly doing in the media availabilities around the releases of reports are reorienting people back to the report, because a lot of times they're trying to weave in other narratives or other things like that. And we say, this is what the report stands on, not going to comment on the political side, but this is what the evidence shows.
Yeah, I think that we're really careful about what's written in the report. I think what gets covered in the media and how people discuss the report are, like Alex said, things that are often out of our hands. I do think that one of the things that's really important is that the report engages or starts new conversations. And so to the extent that a media report then engages people to start thinking about or having conversations or voting or whatever it may be, I think then that plays a really important role.
Yes, and I think one of the things I've observed is when I was involved in the third assessment report, there was very little attention given by the IPCC to providing its participants with any kind of training, support in how do you speak with the public, with the press, and there's a lot more going on with that. So I was a review editor then for the fourth and fifth assessment reports, where there were workshops on doing exactly this, and a lot more professional effort going into this. And I think you see this also across the sciences and social sciences as well, of more of an explicit intention, approach of engaging with the media and the public, as that's part of the role, at least for some scientists. And so that's an important aspect of IPCC being on sort of the leading edge of, it's not enough just to do the science. Some scientists, it's just enough, but many scientists also need to be engaged in that public conversation. Maybe let's talk a bit about, so the IPCC reports are written literally by hundreds of people. Tell us a little bit from your perspectives of who are these authors? How are they chosen? What kinds of backgrounds, disciplinary knowledge are they bringing to this effort?
Well, they look like us. And I think different people get engaged with the IPCC very differently. So I used to teach at Stanford, and back in the early 2000s, there were a number of leaders, people who were in the leadership positions at the IPCC who were at Stanford. And I was an assistant professor there, and I said to several of the senior authors, I said, urbanization is one of the biggest trends right now and in the 21st century, and why is it that the IPCC doesn't talk about cities? And instead, if you look at all the other assessment reports up until the 5th assessment report, cities were treated through sectors, through transport, through buildings, through energy. It was like they had taken the city and broken it up apart into the different components, but there was no chapter dedicated to how cities might mitigate climate change. So I was making it known that this was a big gap. And apparently, apparently some of the countries were thinking this way as well. So for the 5th assessment report, there was a discussion about having a standalone, first time ever chapter on urban mitigation of climate change. So I got involved. I was invited to be part of the scoping meeting. And the scoping meeting is the meeting before we start writing the report, where we scope out what the different working groups will work on, what the chapters will work on. And so that's how I got involved. I don't know, Alex, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say the process begins with that scoping report that says here are the chapters, the basic outline of what we need. But then there's a whole process by which the governments nominate people to be authors. And there's some ability to self-nominate, but for the most part, you're getting authors from country nominations. Then there is an effort to make sure that there's a good balance of gender, global north, global south, people with experience in the IPCC, people who are new. That means different career paths and other things like that. So on my chapter, for example, there were about 15 of us. We came from probably about 14 countries. There were 2 of us from the United States, and other than that, just many, many different countries. It's a very international mix, and it forces you to have those conversations that broaden the appeal and also kind of sand down the rough edges of what you might be putting out. And it was especially important for our chapter because we were looking at regional information. So there's no way that I, sitting in New York City, could have really done an adequate job of understanding different regions, especially when you factor in that we needed to read the literature in Spanish and in Chinese and in different places, to have the local literature represented. So it's a really interesting group. Dr. Lee already mentioned that the people who are in the IPCC are working voluntarily. That means for many of us, it's a great honor to be in the IPCC, but our day job didn't go away. We still had to do everything that we were mostly doing before, and do the IPCC, which in many cases meant early morning phone calls and different commitments on deadlines. So it's very impressive to see from the inside how much effort really goes in.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on the international component because I think that's really essential. So for AR5, it was the first time there was an urban chapter. All of us were new to the IPCC process, so it was like being thrown into something totally new for all of us, did not understand the process. So it was really very, very challenging. Imagine if you enter a process, let's say you take a class for the first time and you have no idea what a test looks like or what exams are, what a syllabus is. So we were about a dozen for that 5th assessment report. And I think the international component is really critical because we're reading very different literatures. And I think it's also really important because ultimately this is the document that informs international and national policymaking. And so we want to make sure that we are assessing the literature that is being written from authors from around the world, but also that the report is written in a way that is accessible to readers and policymakers from around the world. So it's not just about writing for a North American audience or North American policymakers.
Yeah. So in thinking about having this international representation amongst the authors for the IPCC reports, this was a question that Saleem was going to address initially, but maybe Alex and Karen, you might have some thoughts on this of having authors who are coming from the global south as well as authors from the wealthy OECD countries of how has the author teams changed over time? Are we seeing adequate representation from the global south of authors? What are some of the challenges that they face? Are we seeing more authors participating from parts of the world that historically weren't as involved? How has the IPCC been doing work to try and engage a broader, more diverse group of authors?
I'll say something fast, but I know Karen's been involved in two of the reports, so you might have seen a trend that I only saw the end of in AR6. But no, I think it's fascinating, to have that international perspective. It's on every level of the report, by the way, not just on the author team, but also in the vice chairs and the working group chairs and things like that. It's a fascinating process. In my chapter, I had one of my co-authors was from Iran. I was sitting across the table when the U.S. announced that we were pulling out of the Iran treaties. And this politics is, of course, hanging over everything, but it's very easy for us to say, we're here, we're working together on this report, and that's what we're going to do. So, we stick it's very interesting to see how you actually come in, push aside any other geopolitical differences and try to get to know each other and focus on the science. And in that sense, the report really benefits from having all of those different perspectives. And we see it, of course, also in representing the different types of systems. Of course, as we know, agriculture in the United States is very different than agriculture in Senegal or one of the other places that we were focusing on. So having that local perspective is really important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just want to underscore that the geographic representation, it really is across all levels of the IPCC. So without getting into too much of the organizational details of the IPCC, I've already mentioned that there are these 3 working groups, and the 3 working groups are led by co-chairs. And so, in fact, we have one of the co-chairs from Working Group 2, Deborah Roberts, right over there, here from South Africa. And so the co-chairs are also meant to be geographically diverse, as well as the chapters. And so each of the chapters is usually led by 2, sometimes 3, usually 2 coordinating lead authors, and there's one from the Global North and there's one from the Global South. So when I was a coordinating lead author for AR5, so that's the 5th assessment report that was published in 2014, I was my coordinating lead author was from Thailand. Actually, he was from Nepal, but based in Thailand. And then for the 6th assessment report, my co-coordinating lead author was from Uganda, based in the Netherlands, but from Uganda. And then, like Alex, we had an author team of about 12 to 15. And we had 2 Americans, or people based in North America, and then the rest of the author team was literally from around the world, and also from very different disciplines. So I'm trained as a geographer. We'd had atmospheric scientists, we had economists, we had people trained in planning. Really quite a range of disciplines are being represented.
All right.
Can I show my slides at some point?
At any point.
Okay.
Yes. Would you like to show slides
Sure,
now?
sure.
All right. So can we get the slides keyed up that Karen had provided? And maybe while we're waiting for the slides to show, go right ahead.
Okay, yeah, I thought it might be, since this session is on demystifying the IPCC, I thought it might be interesting to show some pictures of what the process looks like. So this is a picture taken from the plenary of the 5th assessment, the plenary for the approval plenary. So after we spend a couple of years writing the report, like the crescendo, it works up to the approval plenary. And so here's a picture. This is so these folks here in the audience, they're the country delegates. And this is pre-COVID. And the lead authors are sitting usually around here. And then what happens is we present the summary for policymakers, and we go line by line through the approval process. I thought it would be fun to show these particular 2 slides. I don't know if folks can see it. the column on the left, the bar on the left, shows the number of words shown as a percentage. So this is the total number of words in the summary for policymakers. What percentage have we gone through and approved? And then the column on the right in red is how much time have we used during the week. So you can see this was I think about day 2 of the plenary approval. We had approved about 8% of the total word count, but we had used already 38% of the time that we had. Here we go. At this point, we had used 94% of the time. We hadn't even approved 50% of the words. So in AR5, the approval plenary was live in person, and we started off meeting, I think it was like 8 or 10 hours a day. And by day 3, as we saw this chart, we realized we need to work through the night. And this is where geographic differences and, let's say, human capacities and variations and differences in financial capacities really come to bear. So if you're a country delegate and you're representing a country and you've got, let's say, a delegation of 2, it becomes very difficult to be part of the negotiations and part of the approval plenary all throughout the night. But if you come from a wealthy country and you are able to have a delegation of 15, then some of your delegates can sleep while others are actually at the approval session. So this is actually what it looks like. These are country representatives. I did not specifically look for a representative from Korea, but here we are what the country representatives look like. And as we're presenting each line of the summary for policymakers, they have their placards up and they get called on to make their comments on the report. So here's the Saudi delegation. And so they can comment on any aspect of the report that we're actually going through. And so as we're presenting the report, the lead authors of that section of the summary for policymakers, they're actually sitting on the dais. And as country delegates raise questions or concerns, then the authors can form a huddle. They can live discuss the comment, discuss the questions, and then report back. So here I am with my co-coordinating lead author, and you can see here on the right, here, this is our section of the summary for policymakers, and literally, again, we are going line by line, word for word to get the SPM approved. And there's a very large media presence there. They're from literally all around the world, so I think the media part is really important, and how the process is portrayed and how the science is reported is critically important. And I thought I'd show some pictures from AR6. So AR6 was a very, very different process. It was all done on Zoom. And for the working group 3, instead of a 1-week approval process, we had a 2-week approval process. And we had very similar statistics that were given to us in terms of how much time is remaining versus how much of the report we had approved. And we started off with pretty set times for the approval process, but then towards the middle of the 2nd week, we were basically meeting almost continuously. And remember, now we're meeting, we have authors and delegates from all around the world. So here I am, a very different process. We're still going through, we still have the same color scheme, but the country delegates are now online. And just like students in class on Zoom, they have to raise their hand using the hand raise function on Zoom. And then we had a virtual huddle. I don't know, Alex, if you want to.
Well, yeah, this is great to see, and bringing back
memories,
mostly non-traumatic memories. The overall process. I'm going to maybe take even one step further back because we haven't talked about the review process yet, and the review process there are many drafts in an IPCC. We have a zero-order draft, first-order draft, second-order draft, final government draft. And every one of those steps, there's opportunities for review comments, and the public really responds. We get tens of thousands of review comments. And as somebody who remembers like my first paper getting 2 reviewers back with 20 comments each and thinking that was going to ruin my year, when you're faced with 10,000 comments, I think my chapter alone had more than 3,000 comments in the last in that report. It really makes the whole chapter better. We have to respond to every review comment individually, and that leads to a lot of good input. One of our biggest frameworks that came out of our chapter originated in some review comments, so we really do listen and reflect on them all. But it also means that when we get to this to the approval session, it's not really a surprise. We don't surprise the governments with the draft. They've seen it, they've reviewed it, they come with questions. And the chapters are mostly kind of approved en masse, but then this summary for policymakers, which is the critical 30 pages or so that summarizes the whole report, that's the line by line. There is some strategy in the way that it's approved, in the sense that we bring up the most likely to be controversial parts first, because we know it's going to take some working through over the course of the week. And there will be those contact groups, those huddles that form to go over different things. As Karen mentioned, virtually having countries that could send more than one person to more than one contact group was an advantage to them. And there were incredible Slack channel dialogues among all the authors trying to figure out, how do we respond to this or that, and come up with compromises, because that, in the end, is what we're trying to do, is we're trying to find the language that represents the science, addresses the governmental concerns, doesn't get lost in the politics, but stays true to the science. And in the end, the report that comes out is approved by the governments, which means it's not just the scientists that say it, it really is a product of the scientists and the governments.
And I just want to clarify, make sure it's clear that we're only approving line by line the summary for policymakers, this 30-page document that Alex described. We're not going through the entire, phone book sized report line by line. That might take a little bit more than 2 weeks.
Yeah, so it's a very unusual process in which you have a group of scientists, other experts who write a 30-page or so summary of a report that they've written, and then you go through a process in which the representatives of national governments pick this apart, question it, make interventions to propose changes, small edits, large edits, major changes. Sometimes this process will be described as being an extremely political process, and one that may bias the summary from what the author's intended messages are. What's been your observation of, is it a political process? Does it result in the summaries in some way becoming inconsistent in any way with the underlying report, or does this all come out in a way where the authors and the governments have reached a common understanding that reflects the science?
I'll say a couple of things on that. So the short answer to your question is that the scientists try to keep it on the science. There's definitely politics involved. We don't show any maps with country borders. That would right away have people objecting, where do you draw that line? Somebody doesn't want it drawn that way and the other person does. We had to make sure we referred to the sea between Korea and Japan properly, because there's disagreement on what the name of that sea is. All these things like that come into play. So those things, for the most part, we keep out. There's definitely there are times where you can see governments trying to represent their geopolitical interests, but the scientists, I think acted, in my experience, quite strongly to say, this is what the science says, and we're going to point to it, and here's the evidence that we show. So in that sense, we're trying to insulate it from the politics. But there are very interesting dynamics, for example, in the sense that when one country objects to something, you may have the scientists push back, and then other countries back the scientists or back the other country, and you get these strange blocks in those compromises and the negotiations. One of the tried and true solutions is a footnote. And I think Working Group 3 had more than 70 footnotes added in the summary for policymakers. So those types of, let's just settle this, but we'll put a statement down here, and then we can move on, can be very useful.
Yeah, I would say there are two big groups of questions or issues that countries raise. One big group of questions are around, like, how rigorous is this? How applicable is this for my region, my country, right? Okay. So is this based on 5 studies that are based on North American cities and not relevant to the cities in Senegal or, let's say, Singapore, right? So I think those are types of questions. And then I think there is a second group of question, which is maybe more on the geopolitics, more on the messaging, which is, okay, so if the science says this, well, we would prefer it to be said in this way. So it's not challenging the underlying science as much as the messaging. And here I think the point that Alex raised is really important, that, you know, the approval process, there's scientists and it's also government delegates. And so there are different delegations that will then, I don't know if I say join forces, but certainly there'll be like alliances over different things. Different wording or different issues that are of interest to different groups of countries. And so that's also really interesting, because it's not just scientists pushing back and saying, this is the way in which it should be framed or phrased, but there are also countries that are saying, well, this is actually how it should be phrased as well. So it's not just a scientist to, delegates, it's also delegate to delegate as well. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting as a scientist to see some of the geopolitics among the country delegates.
Maybe just to add one last thing on that. So you definitely get people who say, how come you don't have my country specifically listed in that list of vulnerable mm-hmm. countries, right? They want to see their name, their interest represented. But the other thing that I'll just note is there's also careless language that is often called out. So for example, it's very dangerous to say, here's a list of developing countries, because what's your definition of developing and not developing? And that just leads to whole hornet's nests of problems.
All right. So we have a question from our virtual audience. And I'll just read this. The situation is dire, and there's no real sense that governments are rising to the crisis and taking necessary action. Is it time for the IPCC to be less politically correct and to speak more frankly?
I'll say that it's the challenge there is, maybe I would separate the question into two things. You could ask the question about whether it's time for climate scientists to speak more frankly. But the IPCC is not the same thing. The IPCC has carved out a very important role in being this apolitical scientific body. And in that sense, that policy prescriptive side would be challenged if there was IPCC, if you're wearing your IPCC hat, making more challenging statements. So I would separate it that way, but I definitely see a couple trends, which is that there is, the way that we talk about the different options that are available and the price of inaction, which had been, previously not as well understood. Those things are being said very clearly.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think that there's a really valuable role that the IPCC plays in being policy relevant, but not being policy prescriptive. And I think that that's really important, because it is an international UN process at the end of the day. And so there are lots of scientists and there are lots of activists who individually and collectively, organizations are speaking very frankly. And I think to have an organization that is assessing the state of the science is really critical, where governments, there's a buy-in from governments that their scientists are part of this process, and that's really, really important.
All right. So I think we'll take some questions from the audience now. So our mic runners, if you can make yourselves visible. So if you have a question, raise your hand and wait for a microphone to reach you. And let's take one here, and then we'll take over here, Grace. We've got the student on the side here. And then we'll look for questions for the virtual audience as well. Please type questions into the chat.
Hello, thank you. I'm Craig Jurgensen. I'm on the Cumberland Valley Clean Air Board, by the way. Is it helpful from a communicative or a language standpoint, this is kind of a general question, that from a standpoint of establishing a sense of unity or consensus building energy, that the common language in this international group is English? I think it's maybe an important question when you think of what kind of agreements can you get, or decision-making, all this language, the documents and things. The commonality, I think, of English is important from the standpoint of a sense of unity in the cause, the purpose, and in the consensus that you hope to reach among such a big group.
Neil, do you want to take several questions, or should we answer this one?
Why don't we go ahead and answer the question, and then we'll take.
I'll give it a start. So, yeah, it's the IPCC reports are translated into all 5 UN languages. So you can get it in Arabic, in French, English. I'm gonna forget them all here. Spanish and Chinese, I think. We do have an effort, but you're right. The process is conducted in English. I always remind myself right before I am nervous for a scientific talk that at least I get to give it in my native language. It's a huge advantage internationally, without a doubt. And there is, in the writing process, we were very careful. We had a whole process that was pushed by the IPCC leadership to try to make people more comfortable to give inputs in the chapter writing. So to reach out and notice, as one of our roles as coordinating lead authors is to get to know our authors, the author team, and if there's somebody who may have a barrier, whether it's time zones or English as a first language or second language, third language maybe, we have to try to engage that person to the best of our ability. It's definitely a challenge, but one that we're aware of and addressing all that we can.
Thanks for all your comments. I have a question about the nature of the different work groups. I think it would be fair to say that as we move from science to impacts to mitigation across the 3 work groups, you're moving from the world of very hard physical science toward more social sciences and all the uncertainties and normative biases that can creep in when you move sort of from work group 1 across then to impacts to then mitigation. Can you comment on that and how that, number one, if it's a valid observation, and then how that affects sort of the processes of the work groups and ultimately the products?
Yes, well, absolutely. I mean, working group 1 is dealing with the physical basis, so there's not a lot of space for normative contributions there. Although you could also argue that, like, what types of data we use, what types of information are being gathered, that actually starts off with somewhat of a normative decision, but that's more about like instrumentation and policy or data design or science design. I would argue that right now we need to rethink the IPCC structure. That right now, so much of, let's say, working group 2 and 3, our work is really intertwined. I mean, there's a lot of concern that efforts to mitigate climate change might, in fact, lead to maladaptation, either in the places that are mitigating or elsewhere. We really need to think about mitigation and adaptation jointly. So that's one thing. And then certainly working group 1 is not completely isolated from what the impacts are and what the mitigation strategies are. So I would completely be an advocate for rethinking the working groups.
Yeah, I'll say a couple things on that. There was also a set of 3 special reports in the 6th assessment report cycle, which were designed to be cross-cutting across the working groups. There was one on global warming at 1.5 degrees. There was one on climate change and land, and there was one on oceans and cryosphere. So we do try to break down those working group barriers. Funny anecdote, I was a water cycle expert for my PhD. I studied droughts and things like that. When I told my PhD advisor that I was pursuing a career in climate impacts on agriculture, which is what I spent a lot of my time doing, they say, oh, it's too bad you're leaving the sciences. They thought when I was moving from that physical science into impacts and social and all that, they thought that was leaving science. And I fully disagree with the idea that one is more science than the other. But there is this motion, from kind of the physical hazard side to, I think, in working group 2 and 3, a more complete discussion of risk, which has to include vulnerability and exposure and all of these other constraints and motivations on people's decision making. And I'm now working on the synthesis report, which is the culminating report that pulls all of these working groups and special reports together. And it's quite interesting to see how the working group 1 science kind of starts the conversation, opens the door, but really a lot of the bulk of the challenge right now is in that working group 2 and working group 3 space about what do we do, how do we prepare.
So I'm going to take a question now from our virtual audience, and I'd like for students in the room to be thinking about what question you want to ask, and you'll get the next one after the question from the virtual audience. So one of our audience members is asking, what is the IPCC doing to make the science more accessible? I'd say what you're doing right now is one piece of that, but certainly there's a lot of work the IPCC is doing to try and make this work accessible to more audiences and more actionable in some ways.
Yeah, I think for this assessment cycle, one thing that I think is relatively new, I don't remember doing it in AR5, is that the IPCC has generated a number of fact sheets for each of the working groups. So these are 1 or 2 page fact sheets that further distill the chapter into just like a 2-page document. And those are really policy relevant. They're like the key findings from the chapter, with some nice infographics. So I think that that's a very tangible example of IPCC making the science more accessible. So you could go onto the IPCC website and download a number of these fact sheets. I think the outreach communications that we're doing, events like this, is also really important because, it's one thing to download a fact sheet, but then it's another to actually meet the folks, the scientists who are actually writing the report and engaging with the public. I think that that's really important. And I think that there's a whole other domino effect of writing the reports and engaging with the public. And for me, it's really important to engage the young people. So it's not just young people who are college students. I think more and more the IPCC has a role to play in engaging folks who are K through 12. So I have a 15-year-old son, and when I look at the IPCC reports and I look, wow, what's going to happen in the next 20 to 30 years, and when he is my age, it's going to be really dire. It's dire now in many ways, but we absolutely need to engage the young people, younger people, I should say. And I think a lot of this is also making decisions around every aspect of our lives, whether we're walking to work. I mean, little things like that, whether you're walking to work or whether you're biking or whether you're driving. One of the biggest decisions that we can have on the climate in our lives is actually where we choose to live versus where we work. That has such a big impact on everything from transport emissions to building emissions. But I think engaging with young people is really, really critical because this is your future that we're talking about.
I think we have in the audience, do we have the group from the Cumberland Valley High School here today? If so, put your hands up. Yeah. There we go. All right. Thank you.
Let me add a little bit to this. There are a bunch of things that also make all the IPCC findings more accessible. We have, in Working Group 1, we have an interactive atlas online now where you can go and manipulate and make your own maps, different metrics and time periods and scenarios, which is really cool. We already mentioned the fact sheets. We have regional outreach, done in local languages. There are ways you can get the underlying data for the figures that we show in the report. And we also in Working Group 1 have worked with the insurance community, the actuaries. So we have a IPCC Working Group 1 summary for actuaries. And right now we're putting the finishing touches on a summary for non-scientists. This is also part of the idea that getting that information out there is also one of the enabling conditions for climate action. When you look at the Working Group 2 and 3 reports, we talk about studies of social movements and how do those influence the political and social space behavioral and sociocultural conditions that allow these types of climate actions to take hold.
We're really tight on time here, but if there is a question from a student in the audience, very quickly, let's see if we can take it. We have one. Is this a student up in the upper deck? Okay, yeah. Grace, if you could run a mic over there.
Hello? Okay. I'm kind of curious about the difference between Working Group 1 and Working Groups 2 and 3 when it comes to the review process. I imagine in recent years that a lot of the physical science tends to be less controversial. I'm curious if in the review process there is more, arguments or conflicts about framing, wording, any of that sort of thing in the second and third working groups as opposed to the first working group.
I'll give a quick answer for Working Group 1 and then pass to Karen for the other side. First of all, I think our next panel is going to talk about some evidence, and we're going to talk about the evidence that we're presenting then. But what has happened in each successive assessment report is the level of evidence, and more specifically, the level of attribution of how are humans influencing the climate system, that has gotten stronger. So we are going further in our ability to point to the human signature, the human influence on the climate system. So you're right that there are things that used to be controversial that no longer are, but we are finding new things, and there's definitely still some controversy there.
Yeah, I was going to say it's probably hard for us to compare since I've not seen the comments for Working Group 1 and he hasn't seen them for Working Group 3. I will say that for many of the comments, as I said earlier, they fall into the category of, is this relevant for my region? And how is this, what is the evidence for whether this strategy would actually mitigate emissions for these types of places in these regions of the world? So I think they're more locally specific than maybe more at the regional or global scale.
All right. So we are at the end of our time here, so please join me in thanking our panelists. And send our thoughts and good wishes to Saleemul in Bangladesh and hope that all is well there. Our next session is titled Climate Change Evidence and Causes. Alex will be part of that session. That starts at 1:30 p.m. If you're going to attend that session in person, we ask you to be in the room, be in your seat before 1:30. If you're watching the audience, watching virtually, please come back and join us at 1:30. The links for the live stream are on the website. And with that, thank you, and we're concluded.
Thanks.